Hello, BookTube. Well, here we are in our third week of our epic read-along of Herman Melville's Moby-Dick. And this segment will be a little shorter, I think, than the previous two, partly because I'm feeling a bit under the weather, but also partly because I think the chapters that we are reading now, from the blanket to the Pequod meeting the Samuel Enderby of London, are, if you had to nail a specific stretch, the doldrums of Moby-Dick. In that entire stretch of time, the entire stretch of the chapters that we're reading for today, not much happens. There's a great deal more of exposition about whaling, and I want to stress that the kind of exposition that we get about whaling is different from what we've had in previous segments that we've been reading. The exposition that we get in this chunk of the book very much aligns with my conceit that Melville keeps a lot of this stuff in order to give you everything you need to know in order to understand the world of whales and whaling in the 19th century. This actually includes a section called the Try-Works, and I would say that all of those expository sections are the Try-Works of the book, where you're not just getting the drama of life on board, and you're not just getting the higher drama of Ahab's insanity, but you're also getting the world of whaling. You get a lot of that in the chapters that we're reading this time around, and very little else. There's speculation between Starbuck and Stubb about Fedallah and the demon crew members that Ahab seems to have under his private control, and the Pequod meets with a series of ships, the Jungfrau, the Mary Rose, the Samuel Enderby of London, the Jeroboam. As the Pequod begins to approach whaling grounds, the Pequod starts to meet other ships, and Ahab's shouted greeting is always the same. Hast thou seen the white whale? He isn't, and his follow-up is always the same. He's not all that interested in anything to do with you if you haven't. But most of the chapters in here are taken up with the inner workings of what it's like to actually be on a whaling vessel of the time and place. Melville had done that, and I'm hoping, those of you who are actually reading along, I'm hoping that by this point you are sufficiently under the spell of his prose so that you're reading these chapters and not considering them much of a trial. I think if this much solid exposition were happening without the spell of that prose, I don't think anyone would be able to pull it off, Melville included. I think he does in this, but it's in this stretch of chapters that the balance between as I've been putting it, the seafaring adventure novel of the whale and the altogether more biblical allegory of Moby-Dick, it's in these chapters that I think that contrast rests most uneasy on the page. I think these chapters, those of you who are reading along will have to tell me if you agree, but I think these chapters are the hardest part to get through in Moby-Dick. The section that we'll be dealing with last begins to pull to itself an unholy sense of momentum. But there's precious little of momentum, a precious little feeling of narrative movement in these chapters. There are some poetic moments. There's a moment when, and keep in mind here that when I'm talking about all of this, I am leaving out the barbarity of the practice of whaling just in general, right? I haven't mentioned that. I haven't harped on it. We're not talking about whaling as a practice. We're talking about whaling as a literary example in a book. So I am perfectly capable of appreciating the sounding prose poetry of a scene in which Ahab addresses the severed head of a whale instead of hanging my enjoyment up on a peg and only being outraged by the fact that such a thing happened at all. And that passage where Ahab talks to the severed head of a whale has some wonderful Melvillian prose. I want to read it because it's such a joy to read out loud. Speak, thou vast and venerable head, muttered Ahab. Keep in mind, Ishmael can hear him do this. Which, though ungarnished with a beard, yet here and there looketh hoary with mosses. Speak, mighty head, and tell us the secret thing that is in thee. Of all the divers thou hast dived the deepest. That head upon which the upper sun now gleams has moved amidst the world's foundations. Where unrecorded names and navies rust, and untold hopes and anchors rot, Where in her murderous hold this frigate earth is ballast with bones of millions of the drowned, there in that awful waterland, there was thy most familiar home. Thou hast been where bell and diver never went. Thou hast slept where by many a sailor's side, where sleepless mothers would give their lives to lay them down. Thou sawest the locked lovers when leaping from the flaming ship. Heart to heart they sank beneath the exulting wave, true to each other when the heavens seemed false to them. Thou sawest the murdered mate when tossed by pirates from the midnight deck. For hours he fell into the deeper midnight of the insatiate maw, and his murderers still sailed on unharmed, while swift lightning shivered the neighboring ships that would have borne a righteous husband to outstretched longing arms. O head, thou hast seen enough to split the planet and make an infidel of Abraham, and not one syllable is thine. That's lovely stuff. And it would only be a very snowflakey reader, a very priggish reader, who would point out in the midst of such rounding prose that the whale whose head had been severed was telling long and intricate stories for probably 60 years before he was killed by the crew of the Pequod. He's mute because everyone's severed head is mute. But we go on. From there, we get life on board, precious little changes for our characters, which gives Melville a chance to drop a whole lot more exposition. We get a whole lot more exposition. And it also, almost like in a becalmed ship at sea, it gives Melville extra time on his hands for apostrophizing. And one of the little soliloquies, the little prose soliloquies that he does in the chapters that we're covering today is infamous. It is infamous. Legions of literary critics have swarmed upon these words in order to figure out Melville, not to figure out Moby-Dick, but to figure out Melville. I'm sure that a lot of you, if you're reading along, will know the passage I'm talking about, but I can't resist the urge to read it out loud. It's in the chapter called A Squeeze of the Hand, and it kind of sort of speaks for itself. Ishmael is in the process of kneading out the sperm oil. He's at the very heart of the commercial enterprise of what the Pequod and all other whaling vessels do. And we get this. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. All the morning long. I squeezed that sperm till I myself almost melted into it. I squeezed that sperm till a strange sort of insanity came over me. And I found myself unwittingly squeezing my co-laborers' hands in it, making their hands for the gentle globules. Such an abounding, affectionate, friendly, loving feeling did this avocation beget, that at last I was continuously squeezing their hands and looking up into their eyes sentimentally, as much as to say, "Oh, dear fellow beings, why should we longer cherish any social acerbities, or know the slightest ill humor or envy? Come, let us squeeze hands all round. Nay, let us all squeeze ourselves into each other. Let us squeeze ourselves universally into the very milk and sperm of kindness." That is Ishmael working globules of spermaceti oil out of the fat of the head, of the ton of the head. But many, many, many later critics have said that could be something else. They point out that Melville had certain conflicted natures running through his life, that Melville's devotion to some of his male friends seemed a little strange, even by the very sentimental measuring rod of the 19th century. And they point out that there are no women in Moby-Dick. And they could go a lot further, and some of them do. There are many, many what we now in the 21st century call queer readings of Moby-Dick. But that passage is a lodestar to all of them. I myself think that it's not. I think those readings are excessive. I think what Melville most longed for in his whole life was brotherhood, was an ineffable feeling of bonding with another human being. I think he longed for that. He wandered for it. He mostly didn't get it. And I think that's what he's giving vent to there. I don't think that we need to read any more into it than that. Although it does stand out, even now. I have taught this book, and I've also informally handed it to plenty of people, and I've lost count of the number of people who come back to me in the whole huge wide range of this book who've come back to me about and said, what on earth is that particular passage? But the climax of the chapters that we're doing today is the Pequod running into the Samuel Enderby of London, another whaling vessel. And it's not just any other whaling vessel. By now, the Pequod has met several vessels. Captain Ahab always hails them with, "Hast thou seen the white whale?" Sometimes they have. Sometimes they've only heard of it. Samuel Enderby is different. The captain of the Samuel Enderby has an ivory arm. Not an ivory leg, but an ivory arm. And the reason why he does is not because he lost his arm in an accident, and it's not because he lost his arm to a whale. It's that he lost his arm to Moby-Dick. Moby-Dick caused his arm to be ripped off at the shoulder, and he now has an ivory arm. And yet, the captain of the Samuel Enderby is incredibly happy. He's a jovial, happy fellow. He's joking with the doctor that cut off his arm the whole of the chapter, much to Ahab's mounting irritation. And that doctor is astonished. The more he is in Ahab's proximity, the more he starts to sense Ahab's boiling blood. We've already been told this. Chapters and chapters and chapters ago, we were told that when the cabin boys go down into Ahab's bed to make his cabin when he's not there, the sheets are burning hot and twisted as if he's been fighting all night long instead of sleeping. Something changed fundamentally in Ahab, so that even strangers notice it. They don't have to sign on the Pequod and then wait for him to announce it. They notice it right away. And Ahab is first confused and then angered by the joviality of the captain of the Samuel Enderby and by his doctor. All he wants to know about is it for sure that you saw Moby-Dick? And if so, when and how soon? That's all he cares about. But the captain of the Samuel Enderby, it's impossible to read that encounter without thinking about what Ahab might have been. What would have happened if Ahab had had his experience, even the experience with Moby-Dick, only hadn't already been Ahab when it happened. Remember, we were told at the beginning of this book, not only by the weird, ragged prophet Elijah, but also heavily indicated by Captains Peleg and Bildad, we're told that Ahab was a strange person before he lost his leg. And something about that confrontation with this whale snapped into some sort of weird change in Ahab. Whereas, with the captain of the Samuel Enderby, we get a clear image of what it is like to lose a limb to Moby-Dick if you're not Ahab. The captain is well-adjusted, and he keeps perspective, and he mentions, well, yes, you could fill a whole ship with the oil that you would harvest from that one whale, but it's surely not worth it. He glances at Ahab's leg when he says that. He says, surely it's not worth it. Surely just let it, some things are better left alone. Of course, by now in the book, we know that nothing will fall on deafer ears than that when it comes to saying something like that to Ahab. And he quickly disentangles himself from the Samuel Enderby because the trail is now hot. And that is where we leave our reading for today. We leave our reading for today with Ahab being presented directly with the path not taken. It is the most, all of the ships that the Pequod encounters are warnings. They are all, I think, tossed life drafts of one way or another. They are all faint or slightly stronger chances at redemption, chances at turning around, chances at waking up and seeing what you're doing. And you would think that meeting a captain who lost a limb to Moby-Dick would be the ultimate such example, the ultimate wake-up call. But there's one worse. There's one still to come that's worse. But up until that, this is the worst. That's where we're going to end for today. We're going to end with Ahab meeting another person who has been maimed by Moby-Dick. That is the kind of parallel that is, it's, I think, a perfect example of the dual nature of this book, because that would work perfectly well as a piece of, picaresque coincidence in the sea novel, in a sea yarn of the type that Melville might have originally envisioned this book to be. And it also works really well in the much more allegorical book that he ends up writing. And that's where we part for today. We part on the precipice of greater momentum. because from the Samuel Enderby, Ahab now knows that Moby-Dick is near. So we'll stop there for now. Those of you who are reading along, I'm bracing myself to hear disappointment. So I want to know what you think of this block of chapters. It's usually been my experience that people reading this book for the first time find this stretch the hardest in the whole book. And then we move on. We will conclude our read-along of Moby-Dick next time with the epic downhill sleigh ride of the chase day 1, the chase day 2, the chase day 3, but also everything leading up to then, when the skies of the narrative start to darken. So we will. Sorry to cut this so short. I just feel terrible. And it hurts to talk. So I will wrap this up for now. I want to know what you think of this stretch. This is an unteachably tough stretch of Moby-Dick, in my experience. So if I hear from some of you that you enjoyed it all the same, especially if I hear from some of you that you enjoyed it for, I think, the only reason that it can be enjoyed, which is that by this point you love Melville's storytelling voice and would listen to him write about anything. I'd love to hear that. If that's true for some of you, I'll be glad to know that that is still the case. And then we will move on next time to the thing that we've been waiting for this whole time. Ahab confronts Moby-Dick. We will move on to that in the next and final installment in this read-along. So I will end this here, but I will return. Thank you, BookTube.